Today we're going to be talking about human reproduction, and more specifically, we are going to be talking about reproduction in somebody who has ovaries, a uterus, a vagina, so somebody who is assigned female at birth, perhaps. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, the parts, the functions, what everything does. So first thing we're going to write down is that the ovary is the reproductive organ. So typically, not all the time, but typically somebody who is assigned female at birth will have ovaries, and these are the reproductive organs. You see a picture here. This is the whole uterus. The ovaries are these white parts right here. And the function of the ovaries is to make and release eggs, and the eggs are called ova. These eggs will sometimes go on to be fertilized or other times are not fertilized and then will be released out of the body. The ovaries are about the size of an almond, a little bit bigger, and they can vary in size, which is why I put an almond there. So if you think about holding an almond in your hand, that's the size of the ovary. You have two of them, or people have two of them. It also makes and releases hormones, and there's two hormones that it makes and releases, and those hormones are estrogen and progesterone. You might hear about these. These are in a lot of contraceptives. So birth control pill typically has estrogen and progesterone. IUDs oftentimes have at least one form of these as well. So I have a diagram here. You can get this diagram from me later if you don't have it right now, but we're just going to label the ovary. So you have people who are assigned female at birth have two ovaries typically. There are some cases where people are born with just one and they can function just fine, but there are two. So these are the ovaries where the eggs are made. So let's take a look. Ova, or eggs. Okay, it says germ cells. We're gonna consider these eggs. Okay, so let's look at this graph. When does someone who is assigned female at birth have the most number of eggs? Look at, right before they're born. 7 months, right? People are typically born 9-10 months. So right before they're born, and then notice it decreases. But look at 7 million. That's so many eggs. 7 million eggs. And then typically it declines. And then at puberty, when those eggs start to mature, we get 400,000. So there's 400,000 eggs that you have. Where did the other eggs go? They disappeared. They got reabsorbed into the body. So you have 400,000 at puberty when they start being released. So let's talk about ova, or eggs. Eggs have 23 chromosomes and their own food supply. Remember back when we talked about meiosis? Meiosis is cell division to produce cells with half the number of chromosomes. And the reason here is because an egg and a sperm each have to have 23 to combine to make 46, which is how many a baby would have. They're made before birth. As you just saw, the most number are right before birth. But they're released from puberty to menopause. So from puberty on to about age 50. So we'll talk more about this, but basically the eggs mature during puberty. They're kind of immature before. They mature during puberty, and then they're released once a month until menopause. So ovulation. This is when eggs are released. You can see this is a picture of an ovary. This is a follicle. A follicle surrounds an egg here. And the egg, and you can actually see this with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope because it's the largest cell in the body. So what happens is you can see in this picture, and we'll talk more about this, but basically these immature eggs, they get bigger and bigger, and eventually they're released. So the egg is the little tiny speckle here. And when they're released, they're going to go into this tube. And then the thing that's around the eggs, the follicle, kind of dies off. So the follicle around the egg ruptures, releases an egg every 28 days. It takes a while for that egg to get all the way down. Okay, we'll talk about what happens. It can either get fertilized or not. If it doesn't get fertilized, this is why someone who's assigned female at birth will typically have their period. So let's just think about this. You don't need to write this down, but if an egg is released every 28 days, from 12 years old to 50 years old, how many eggs are released? Only about 400. So we do the math every 28 days for 38 years. Basically once a month for 38 years. How many eggs are released? Only 400. Well, remember on our graph, we said there were 400,000? So not all of our eggs are used. So let's talk about where the egg goes once it's released from the ovary. So the egg, excuse me, the egg leaves the ovary. The egg is going to leave the ovary. Remember our little almond-shaped ovary here? And it's going to try to get into the fallopian tube here. These two aren't connected. So it kind of has to make this little journey without, a little like guiding area here because they're not actually connected. Now this fallopian tube has little hairs, little cilia. We've talked about hairs like in your trachea to prevent food or provide that little tickle in your throat when you get food or water down there. So these little hairs push the egg along because the egg doesn't really swim. It doesn't have a little tail like sperm, so it gets pushed along. So we're going to go ahead and label. We already did the ovary. Go ahead and write fallopian tube here. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as the oviduct for the fallopian tube. Same thing, just a different word. Again, we have two fallopian tubes here. Sometimes people are born with only one and they can function totally normally. Just depends. So our egg's released from the ovary, it's traveling in the fallopian tube. Now the egg must be fertilized within 24 hours. So an egg only lives for 24 hours. Notice we see some little sperm here. So what happens is the sperm are actually going to travel up into the fallopian tube, and this, in the fallopian tube, is where our egg gets fertilized. So our egg's fertilized in the fallopian tube. Once it's fertilized, the egg is going to implant into the lining of the uterus. So the uterus, the lining, is called the endometrium. Kind of burrows its way in there and it sticks there then for 9 or 10 months as pregnancy. And the reason that it kind of goes into this endometrium and sticks there is because this layer of cells, the endometrium, gives it water and nutrients. So the egg already has some food, a food source in it, but that's only going to last so long. Eventually, we know that a placenta will grow and the blood cells and blood vessels will grow, and then whatever the parent eats or drinks or the nutrients will then go to the egg. So if it's not fertilized, the egg is going to die and it disintegrates. And this becomes a woman's or a person's period, okay? So this is when the egg dies, the lining kind of fades away, dissolves away, and then gets discharged out of the vagina. We'll talk more about that later. So we've got some things to label. So our uterus here, which is theoretically this whole thing, the uterus, it's really muscular. And the reason it's a muscle, it's really muscular, is because you may have heard of contractions. So when somebody is pregnant, the uterus contracts to get the baby to leave, okay? And also to widen this part, which is the cervix. We have the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus that we talked about. Here is the cervix. So the cervix is like the entryway point into the uterus. When you're pregnant and when you're going into labor, your cervix will actually widen, and they will measure how wide, how dilated your cervix is. The opening, it gets as big as your hand, 10 centimeters or bigger, okay? And that's so that the baby's head can go through. So cervix is just the opening to the uterus. And then we have the vagina, which is just the canal here. So theoretically, if you were to stick anything up here, it would not be able to get into the uterus because we have this cervix here. It's kind of this small little opening.